No nation, no army is entitled to target women and children. And for that, we strongly condemned the action of the British government and the British Army here.
It was done in the Anglo-Boer War by the Brits. It was done again by the British in Malaysia. Called different names, of course, in each instance. I had reserves in one instance, strategic hamlets in the case of the Vietnam War, outright concentration camps in the case of the Anglo-Boer War.
The term concentration camp was first given notoriety in the English language during this war. The term comes from the Spanish, concentrado, and the actual process had been used by General Butcher Weyler in Cuba in 1896, when something like 500,000 Cuban civilians were rounded up and put in fortified villages, in which something like 100,000 of them died.
The Weyler method, as it became known, was reviled throughout the world. Everybody, including Britain, was against it. And yet it was used by Kitchener as a method of punishment for the women and children.
The effect of the concentration camps and the illness and the starvation in them certainly led to an awful lot of Boer women and children losing their lives. But I don't think this was genocide in the way we discuss it at the moment. But it was certainly callous disregard for life, contempt, if you like, for the sanctity of life of people, even if they are opponents. And there's nothing praiseworthy about the way the British Army conducted the Boer War.
What happened and what it turned out to be was a human tragedy of immense and catastrophic proportions. And it is a story that needs to be told properly and well. It has been lost in a mountain of disinformation and propaganda, misinformation and lies. I think the time has come now to shake it out, open it up, and spread it to everybody who should know.
For the Boer people, the loss of, I will estimate 32,000, but the official figure is 27,927, I believe, was a significant percentage for the Boer people. For the African people, probably about 25,000, but at least 20,000. It is less of a loss percentage-wise, but a great tragedy nevertheless. Was there a Boer Holocaust?
It was genocide. Very, very clear genocide. It started off as a war against the Boers, the republics, and then for military reasons they started with the concentration camps, but that then spilled over. And then they used the Cuban methods. Then in fact the war turned into genocide.
It was planned. Nobody can say they didn't know, especially the commanders.
How could they not know? Concentration means disease. You don't need a policy, you just need to neglect.
41 camps right over the country. There was a central command that got all the statistics and saw this happening. This is a nation dying.
I'm quite sure that there was no intention on the part of the British military that women and children should die like flies in camps.
There is no evidence of a deliberate policy to exterminate.
And it's therefore wildly, grotesquely incorrect and unjust to accuse the British of a genocide or an attempted genocide of the Afrikaner population.
It's very easy to take the word concentration camp and think of it in terms of the Nazis.
When Goebbels pointed out that the British had set up concentration camps, he was really mistaking concentration camps in the British sense in South Africa with the extermination camps that the Nazis had set up and which he himself was involved with. And this was a classic propaganda technique.
Obviously, from the point of view of the victim, any difference may be semantic. I mean, if you die, you die. And if you almost starve, you almost starve. Doesn't matter what the policy behind it is.
Now, whether you're going to do it by shooting him through the head immediately or by slowly starving to the death. I mean, it's the same principle.
For the Boer people, the number of women and children and old people who died in the concentration camps, percentage-wise, was a Holocaust.
England should never have done that. To strike down 2 independent republics must have lowered our whole position in the world.
It was the year 1899, the high noon of British imperialism. Britain was the globe's greatest trader, and its empire encompassed more than a quarter of the human race. The passionate figurehead of the empire was the 80-year-old Queen Victoria. She did not have ministers of defense. She had ministers of war. Indeed, not a single year of her 64-year reign passed without military conflict. At the turn of the century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. Britain, France, Germany and Belgium were involved in a fierce inter-imperialist rivalry for control of the continent's mineral riches. In southern Africa, the Cape and Natal were already British colonies. In the centre lay the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, where the Boers, descendants of the early Dutch, French and German settlers, had established independent republics. And Britain had old scores to settle. A few years before, in 1881, Britain suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Majuba Hill during the First Boer War, through which the Transvaal regained its independence. 5 years later, in 1886, Providence decreed the discovery of the richest goldfield the world has ever known in the Transvaal. The newfound economic and political power of the Republic threatened British dominance and control of the region. On the Boer side, President Paul Kruger, the staunchly conservative father of the Republic, could not be moved to recognize the political aspirations of the fortune seekers, mostly British subjects, who streamed into his country in the rush for gold. They were regarded as Uitlanders, or foreigners. In the opposite corner to Kruger was Cecil John Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, who was determined that the Union Jack would fly over all of Africa. But Rhodes was forced to resign in January 1896 after a blundered coup attempt in the Transvaal by his associate, Dr. Jameson. President Steyn of the Free State saw Jameson's raid as a sign of Britain's intentions to violently overthrow the Boer governments. He joined Kruger's cause by treaty in 1897. Kruger and Steyn's chief antagonist was Sir Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner in South Africa. A man with grand visions of a unified empire producing gold and diamonds for his queen. British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain supported Milner in using the disenfranchisement of British subjects in the Transvaal as a vehicle to push the dispute to the brink of war. President Kruger issued an ultimatum for the withdrawal of British troops, which was predictably rejected. Britain was effectively at war again on the 11th of October 1899, and for a brief moment, South Africa was the centre of world attention. With the advent of the media war, the unfolding events enjoyed extensive coverage in newspapers all over the globe, supported for the first time by photographs and moving pictures. Soldiers arrived from all corners of the empire to serve the Queen. while volunteers from continental Europe, Russia and the USA supported the Boer cause. The world was at war in Africa. Under the leadership of General Koos de la Rey, the first shot was fired on the 12th of October 1899 when a group of Boers captured a British armoured train at Kraipan on the Western Front. This war was dominated by the sheer expanse of southern Africa. The potential area of hostilities stretched from Cape Town to the Zambezi, an area equal to all of Europe between Dublin and Vienna. The Boers strategically took the offensive by laying siege to 3 front towns in British territory, Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith. The railways determined military strategy due to the size of the land. The speediest advance lay in possession of the 4 tracks originating in the seaports of the British colonies. At first, the Boers had the advantage of mobility, speed and surprise. British troops arrived late and were ill-prepared. Britain's initial reverses culminated in what became known as Black Week in mid-December 1899. British generals experienced 3 major defeats in 1 week: at Stormberg on the southern front, at the Battle of Marsfontein in the west, and under General Buller at Colenso on the Natal front against Boer General Louis Botha. Among the casualties was Lieutenant Freddie Roberts, son of Field Marshal Lord Roberts. In the wake of Black Week, Roberts replaced General Buller as his Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in South Africa. With him came Lord Kitchener as his Chief of Staff. In January 1900, they took charge of an army that was eventually larger than the entire Boer population of the Transvaal. The second British offensive started in February 1900. Lord Roberts's great flank march, called the Steamroller, marched on Bloemfontein and Pretoria. This massive assault column managed to relieve Kimberley and Mafeking. From Natal, Buller's advance relieved Ladysmith. The Boer army was forced to withdraw. The Steamroller March eventually led to a major Boer defeat when General Piet Cronje surrendered with 4,000 men at Paardeberg. The capture of Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, set the seal on the complete reversal of fortune for the Boer cause. The stage was now set to destroy the 2 Boer republics and force the Boers to surrender.
Now, when Roberts took control of Bloemfontein on the 13th of March, he thought that now the war in the Free State basically would have been over. But definitely he thought the war would be over after he captured Pretoria on the 5th of June.
Which is what Roberts thought. Fight the war, take Bloemfontein, take Pretoria, and then the Boers, who are after all European people like us, will recognize that the seat of power has fallen and they therefore surrender, and that is the end of the war.
This is what the handbook said should happen, but they didn't. They simply went on to another phase, the guerrilla phase of the war, and the war escalated, and the guerrilla phase lasted much longer than the initial phases.
All the Boers did was they merely established a government in the field. So President Steyn and members of his cabinet simply accompanied General de Wet most of the time, and from that commando he still governed the country to the extent that it was still possible. And the same happened in the Transvaal.
Telegraph lines were cut, bridges were blown up, communications were disrupted, ammunition depots were raided, many Boer commandos were armed with British rifles, British ammunition and even items of British clothing.
Although they might be lesser breeds without the law, as Kipling once wrote, they were tremendously good fighters, superb marksmen, able to escape from a battle and come in at a different angle almost immediately, good night fighters, all the sort of things that the British actually hadn't been preparing for and weren't very good at.
The British Army tried to transform their slow-moving troops into mounted infantry. Great numbers of reinforcements arrived from the colonies, especially Australia, New Zealand and Canada. Australians were good horsemen, and were soon able to fight the Boers on the same level in the field.
For the period from September 1899 onwards, one has a situation in which a British army, which by the beginning of the following year is numbering 200,000 troops in South Africa, are facing Boer commandos fighting a guerrilla war of no more than 25,000.
They figured that, well, this huge elephant, if you put an ant into its trunk and it itches there, it's going to cause a lot of irritation.
So there was a great deal of frustration among the British, who had expected to be home after about 6 months of war. And the scorched earth policy was partly due to that frustration.
The scorched earth policy was something that developed over a year during 1900. With Lord Roberts in Pretoria on the 5th of June, he found himself isolated from the outside world 2 days later, telegraphically, because General Christian de Wet had attacked his supply columns at Roodeval in the Free State and also cut the telegraph communications. And the way to punish the Boers who were attacking this line was with a new proclamation on the 16th of June 1900.
It seems to me it was like a horsefly stinging a horse. Roberts obviously lost his temper. He ordered, no longer would he be so kind. He didn't say burn the houses, he said blow them up.
And Lord Roberts said to his officers to burn down the farm closest to such an attack on the railway line. And I can think of no better example than Christian de Wet's farmstead on his farm, Rodepoort, near Roodeval. And this was burnt on the morning of 16 June 1900.
And then he began saying any houses within a radius of 1 mile of where the railway was blown up, those houses must be blown up and the people taken prisoners of war. Later, he said within 10 square miles, everything would be blown up.
Now that is a major area. I mean, if you take that as a radius, you've got almost 250 square miles, I think, that is burned down because of one incident. And this was a dramatic new step in the direction of scorched earth.
Lord Roberts, who had spent a lot of time in India, carried it out there after he'd won his Victoria Cross with startling results. He found that if anybody was uppity, burn the place down.
On the 29th of November 1900, Lord Roberts handed over command as Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in South Africa to his successor, Lord Kitchener. And Lord Roberts was convinced, as a matter of fact, he actually put this in writing, that only police work was now left.
Early on, Kitchener is keen on coming to an honourable peace with Boer generals who he actually does respect, in fact, as opponents. But when they don't see reason in his terms, then it seems to me that all the niceties, the gloves come off completely, and Kitchener is absolutely ruthless.
His main aim was to end the war, and as soon as possible, because he wanted to go off to India. He wanted to become the Viceroy of India.
Kitchener's bad reputation has a lot to do with the farm burning. It has a lot to do with the destruction of the countryside, with burning of farmhouses, the destruction of herds, the herding of women and children into the concentration camps, with the dire consequences that had.
The scorched earth policy was partly a reflection of Kitchener's cast of mind. I think Kitchener is one of those great iconic heroic figures in British history, but in fact he's an extremely unpleasant piece of work in many ways.
I don't want to defend Kitchener. I think he was a brutal man. I think his record was of extreme indifference, to put it mildly, to the sufferings of his soldiers. His own men died in dust storms without water. His record to wounded of the enemy, the dervishes after Omdurman, not providing any assistance for them, letting them die in an appalling way on the battlefield after his victory. I mean, his record is extremely bad.
In fact, he writes to his nephew, school child, that the Boers don't fight fair. They're always jumping on their little ponies and running away. And he says they don't fight fair like the Sudanese. And of course, we need to remember that at Omdurman, 1896, Kitchener led the British Army against the Sudanese and massacred. I mean, killed, I forget, 40,000 Sudanese peasants, machine-gunned them down for the cost of about 27 British soldiers. But for Kitchener, that was a fair fight because they came on.
He's an astonishing, complex human being, Kitchener. He liked flower arranging and Chinese porcelain and things you don't really expect in the man who also relieved Omdurman and Khartoum. He was utterly driven. He worshipped the army. He had his own very strong and strict code of ethics. He was a very strong Christian.
Kitchener came with a threefold strategy of total war. First, farm burnings or scorched earth. Secondly, the use of concentration camps for civilians. And third, the blockhouse lines, with barbed wire entanglements right across South Africa.
It's an astounding fact to note that 8,000 of these blockhouses of various designs were built all over the country.
Blockhouse lines were initially built at great expense along the railways to prevent the Boers from attacking the vulnerable communication and supply lines of the British. Later, these blockhouses, connected by barbed wire, were built crisscross through the veldt as well. As Lord Kitchener put it in one of his letters, the purpose was to divide the country into paddocks to lessen the freedom of manoeuvre of the Boer commandos.
The Boer guerrilla fighters succeeded in getting through these barbed wire fences and moved at their own free will, especially under the leadership of people like General de Wet, who actually became a secondary objective of the war. There were several attempts just to catch de Wet.
A saddlebag of General de Wet, or one of his messengers rather, was captured. And in there, the Boer leaders are describing that they're not going to quit. And Kitchener's reaction, now we will show them. If that's the way they want it, we will destroy this place. Literally, a nation, a civilized nation, lost its temper against two of the smallest republics in the world.
Approximately 30,000 Boer farms were either totally or partially destroyed. Most of the farms were blown up with dynamite or were burned down. As well as approximately 40 towns, smaller towns, and also villages were either totally or partially destroyed by the British, including a few of the churches.
When Kitchener took over, he set everything on fire. He shot all the sheep and the cattle.
Look, when they came here, the English, they wanted to kill everything on the farmyard, even the chickens. I remember my grandmother told us how they wrung their necks.
They came and took all the old people's chickens. They took them and hung them from their saddles. And off they went. That's what the English did.
And
what still makes me sick to this day is that they shot all the animals in their pens. And what also makes me sick is how horses suffered in the war.
The British had a problem, but what could they do? Their orders were to destroy the farms and the animals. And you know, the British loved their dogs and their horses. It must have been very difficult.
Now, as much as the justification was given from time to time that the Boer woman supplied the commandos from the houses, the Boer woman flew white flags, the Boer woman did this or did that, there is still no justification for burning down a person's house, even though war is war. And then gleefully burn it down, then take axes to pianos, burn books in a prelude to a time that was yet to come in the Second World War. Destroy musical instruments, break open houses, break open chests of drawers, strew clothing around the place. This was wanton destruction.
My ouma was 'n Kaapenaar geweest. Sy was 'n hoogs ontwikkelde.
My grandmother was from the Cape, and she was a highly educated woman. She used to tell us how they set her house on fire and how she wanted to take a small writing table with her. She tried to smuggle it out through a side door, but she couldn't manage, and so she only took out the little drawer with her jewellery and went outside and tried to get away. But one of the people who knew her well, a joiner, of course, wrenched it from her hands and threw its contents onto the fire. She never forgave him for that. Neither him, nor his parents, his family, or his offspring.
In the Book of Corner on the history of the 34th Battalion of the Imperial Yeomanry, there's a very nice story where he explains how they actually carried a piano out of a Boer house before they set it to fire, and a young woman of about 16 years old went out, and in the open she sat down to play the piano, and after she finished she turned to the soldiers and told them that God will curse you.
And of course there were many soldiers who didn't mind doing this. A lot of evidence of that. Soldiers who, roughhouse soldiers from Liverpool and Manchester who'd grown up in gang cultures in inner cities, who quite enjoyed the violence and enjoyed burning farms and sacking farmhouses. But equally there were regular professional soldiers who didn't like doing that, for whom war was not making war upon, as they saw it, women and children.
Bloemtuin, 5 February 1902. I, Johanna Catharina Geldenhuys, declare under oath that on the 22nd of January 1902, I was on the farm Deugdsaam with a 10-year-old girl named Talita Juni Loots. When Remington's troops marched across my farm, I was assaulted by 3 of his soldiers. 2 of them grabbed me and dragged me into the bedroom, while the 3rd one ripped the little girl's clothes off in another room.
Ek wil so ver gaan as om te sê dat hierdie aspek.
I'd go as far as to say that this aspect of South African women's experiences during the Boer War, the rapes, the assaults, the molestations by the British, who regarded them as rightful war booty, has become a kind of sacred cow. I'm sorry to say this, but a veil of silence has been drawn over this, although some women were so embittered that they did make sworn statements in front of magistrates, and in their memoirs they also described exactly what had happened to them.
Het hulle geskryf presies wat met hulle gebeur het.
In the field, 20th February 1902. I, the undersigned Jan Christoffel Joubert, resident at Omdraai, District Bethlehem, Orange Free State, hereby solemnly declare under oath that on or around the 30th of March 1901, a column of His Majesty's troops abducted Miss Elizabeth van der Merwe, only 1 day after she had given birth. The baby, who had passed away, was left lying on a table in the house, and then the place was set on fire. Aforementioned Miss van der Merwe was taken to Liebenberg Vlei on an open carriage, and from there to Heilbron. She passed away shortly after arriving in Heilbron.
Contrary to popular romantic sentiment, the Anglo-Boer War was not a small war, nor was it a white man's war.
About 30,000 blacks participated as armed combatants in the British Army, which is a large number if you bear in mind that as against the 30,000 armed blacks in the British Army, there were only 20,000 Boer bitter enders by the end of the war. I'm not even talking of those guides and dispatch riders used by the British, and labourers, wagon drivers, etc. The black participation, as experienced by the Boers, was either that of blacks assisting the Boers as achterrijers, for instance, henchmen who went with these Boers on commando so that they could either cook their food or groom their horses, or there were other labourers who were also on commando.
The British were quite aware of what was already happening, and that was that black farm workers were smuggling cattle to Basutoland for their masters, their employers. that many blacks were loyal to the Boer people.
I think the blacks supported the Boers very well, and that's probably why they were also put into concentration camps.
The British, would lock everyone up that they found on a farm and put them in a concentration camp.
Inevitably, farm workers, servants and so on couldn't just be left on the farms because that would also pose security risks.
In total, approximately 130,000 black civilians, in other words, the farm labourers who worked on the Boer farms, as well as approximately 160,000 Boer, Afrikaner, white civilians were left destitute. And the question was now what to do with these people. And the British then decided to establish concentration camps, or as they called them, refugee camps, for these people.
The local population would be removed en masse to concentration camps in order to denude the commandos, the means of sustenance, of military intelligence, and so on.
In some cases, the leader of the patrol went to the farms, gave the women and children a chance to load some necessary stuff like beds, etc., onto the wagons. In some cases, it was not allowed, and they were taken to camps without anything else but the clothes on their bodies.
What do you take in 10 minutes? Do you take blankets because you have children? Do you take medicines because you're ill? Do you take pillows? Do you take books? What do you take?
They were taken in open cattle trucks, railway trucks, and in many cases they were left at stations for days on end without any food or any support of any kind.
They brought about 450 here at a time in open railway carriages. People were forced to get onto open carriages full of cattle and horse dung and stay on it for 2 to 3 days without food and water.
Dressed in their finest and their Sunday best, they also had no idea where they were going, what the British intended to do with them.
Some people had to travel for 4 nights in all sorts of weather, and then there was a delay at Springfontein.
And you are offloaded. Whatever goods you have taken with you are indiscriminately thrown on the ground because the coal trucks are needed for coal.
And then they were dropped off at our old station and had to walk several kilometers to the first camp.
From Tromsburg to Springfontein, which isn't very far. It has rained, you are shivering with the cold, you cannot keep warm, and you get to your destination and there is nothing there.
The British Colonial Secretary, Sir Joseph Chamberlain, specifically said in Parliament that these camps were erected for humane reasons. That doesn't tally with the facts.
First camps are called burger camps. They are then referred to as refugee camps, and then within the British documentation itself, they're called concentration camps.
What these camps really were internment camps for detaining women and children who were primarily families of Boers out on commando.
They were not only brought there to shelter and to save them from dying of hunger, but they were also brought there to be punished.
The Boers got food for themselves, fodder for their horses, but also information concerning British troop movements from those civilians, Boer, Afrikaner, women and children who stayed behind on the farms.
And many of these women were sent to the commandos as emissaries to tell them that the British say that if you don't surrender, your farms will be destroyed, your women and children will suffer.
It is such a curious position, hollow and rotten to the heart's core, to have made all over the state large, uncomfortable communities of people whom you call refugees and say you are protecting, but who call themselves prisoners of war, compulsorily detained and detesting your protection.
In my opinion, they were not refugees. A refugee is not a person who is
taken forcibly from their home is burnt, their crops are destroyed, their animals are slaughtered, and they're forcibly removed. That's not a refugee.
Originally they were called refugee camps, which was humbug. They weren't refugee camps. Primarily they were internment camps.
In July 1901, the English abducted us from our homes and brought us to this camp, where we were given tents to live in. We hardly get any food and we get no clothes at all. We have to collect our rations ourselves and carry our own wood, coal and water. At times we are deprived of meat and firewood for up to 3 weeks. However, we do not mind that. We are suffering all of this for the sake of the Transvaal's independence, and I still believe that everything has not been in vain. I greet you and remain your friend, Annie de Wet.
The camps were placed by the military because of military reasons, usually close to a railway line where they could so-called protect them, and because they protected the railway line. But nobody gave a thought to the actual placing of the camp in terms of the weather, call it the infrastructure if you want. In other words, the camps were usually on flat areas, open, exposed to the westerly winds, bitterly cold in winter time, and in summertime, very, very hot. Tents, ragged tents. Sometimes the camps were placed in very flat ground. In other words, after a rainstorm, there was water everywhere.
These concentration camps, and I can talk specifically about the one in Brandfort, it was totally inhospitable for any person to live there. There were no trees. Today there are trees, but 100 years ago, particularly in that winter of 1901, which was a terrible winter, it rained a lot, it was bitterly cold, and that particular terrain had a lot of turf. The water doesn't drain away. We know from reports from the time, also from Emily Hophouse, that people walked up to their calves in mud. They had to live in mud.
One night a thunderstorm flooded all the tents and even leveled some. In many cases the tent pegs were ripped out. In a book, From the Dark Forest, Aunt Besaidnout gives a good description of how the old people ran up and down between the tents during this thunderstorm, with lightning and thunder all around them. She wrote about how the Lord made a parent's arms so strong that a mother could stand in the cold water all night, holding her child, because if she'd put it down, it would surely have drowned or frozen to death.
Betuli was a terrible camp for many reasons. Notwithstanding the water, it was in a bad situation, and it was compounded by the fact that the mountains that surrounded the camp were in fact full of commandos, and the British knew this. I would suggest that the punishment, and it was punishment, was even stricter to women and children in Betuli than it was anywhere else.
I still feel the main cause of the very high death rate was the polluted water, because the people living in the camps used water from the stream that was polluted by the human beings and the animals.
Uncle Petrus Fourie from Betuli was a 9-year-old boy at the time, and he showed me the carcasses of animals that had died of cattle plague and had been thrown into the stream which ran past the camp.
And there were worms in the water as well. Many people died of fever.
Betuli Camp, 25 February 1902. Mr. P.A. Venter. Today it is 5 days since we've had a funeral here. During the course of the past 8 months, there has been a funeral almost daily, dear brother.
Talk about Springfontein, which is a far better camp, and yet also a bad one. What struck me there more than anything else was the wind that came through on a particular day when I was there, and I had a thick jacket and I had a thick shirt. The wind came through me like paper.
Dit moes verskriklik gewees het.
It must have been appalling. 9 children, the oldest being 11, cooped up in a bell tent, and they had to stay there whatever the weather. It got incredibly hot there. So where do you hide? It got hellishly hot in those bell tents.
These people were actually lying on the floor. They had no mattresses. They were in bell tents, which gave very little heat or very little cover and preserved very little heat. So they were suffering with these extreme changes of temperature.
A terrible evil just now is the dew. It is so heavy and comes right through the single canvas of the tents, wetting everything. The night I slept at Norval's Pont, I found this out for myself. Though in a marquee with double canvas, all my clothes were damp through, and these people have to put their things on saturated day after day. In the morning, the gangways are filled with the blankets and odds and ends regularly turned out to dry in the sun. The doctor told me today he highly disapproved of tents for young children and expected a high mortality before June.
In the concentration camps, there was an average of 10 people per tent. And then you have to also keep in mind that they lived like that. They had nowhere else to go. If you look at the extremely high death rate in some camps, you'll see that the average number of people per tent was considerably higher. Batuli was the camp with the second highest death rate, 1,737. And in the Batuli camp, an average of 18 people slept in a bell tent.
In 'n Batuliese kamp het daar gemiddeld 18 mense in 'n beltent geslaap.
Overcrowding. That is very great. Privacy is impossible. In some camps, 2 and even 3 sets of people occupy one tent, and 10 or even 12 persons are frequently herded together in tents of which the cubic capacity is about 500 cubic feet.
Now, the sanitation was very bad in most of the camps. In Bloemfontein, for example, we read in the reports of the British Army that there was 1 lavatory for every 300 persons.
4,600 women and children in the camp, and you had 28 bucket pail toilets. Now, with dysentery, typhoid, diarrhea, pneumonia rampant, measles rampant throughout the camp, how is it humanly possible to get from your tent almost a kilometre away to a latrine? So you couldn't. The ground was fouled.
The effluvia reaching one side of the camp makes those tents at sometimes unbearable and has resulted in tonsillitis and various throat troubles. The people feel these places a terrible degradation.
If we take the camp in Batuli as an example, the sanitation consisted of trenches dug in the soil there. And now you ask now, how do you use a trench? It's very easy, you place logs across the trench.
People fell in. Children fell in. Assuming that this happens, where do you go to clean that child?
The great lack has been soap. Neither in this camp nor in Norval's Pont has any been supplied, and those without money have been unable to wash clothes or person properly. Men don't think of these things unless it is suggested to them. They simply say how dirty these people are.
How can you have, for instance, 4,600 women and children and some old men and frail old ladies in a camp and not give them soap? Soap became a ration only a month or 2 before peace.
Then there is the water supply. It has in many cases been extremely bad, extremely impure and extremely insufficient.
My grandmother was a little girl in the Bloemfontein camp, and to the day of her death she wore lace-up shoes and thick stockings. I could see the white marks on her feet, but I never realized what they were until just before she died. There were water restrictions, and every day they were given just enough water to make 1 kettle full of coffee. But the children elbowed one another, and some were pushed off their feet in their attempts to get hold of this little bit of water. Often some of the little ones, being only 4 or 5 years old, were often knocked over, and that's how my grandmother sustained 3rd-degree burns.
In Bloemfontein, for instance, they rationed water. They got 1 bucket of water per day per family in the beginning. That was for cooking and cleaning purposes.
Second, They have no extra utensil to hold the water when boiled. I propose, therefore, to give each tent another pail or crock and get a proclamation issued that all drinking water must be boiled.
The women had to make do with very little firewood. That was also rationed.
Our generation doesn't realise how those children suffered. They had to walk for miles, many kilometres, to get a bit of wood, and when they came back with the wood, the guard at the gate took it from them. Then no bread could be baked on those days.
Fuel is very scarce. That which is supplied weekly would not cook a meal a day, and they have to search the already bare kopjes for a supply. There is hardly a bit to be had.
The planning for the concentration camps took less than a month.
The camps were run by the military. They were designed for far smaller numbers than were herded into them. The resources of water, food, above all medical and nursing care were grossly inadequate, and maladministration, and one has to put it, simple, low priority.
Die Britte het hulle 240,000 soldaten.
The British had 240,000 soldiers in South Africa, and in addition to that, upwards of 235,000 people in concentration camps, white and black, they had to supply with provisions. In other words, they had to supply daily provisions to 500,000 people, while most of the farms had been burnt down. The logistics of getting those provisions to the people at the right time were virtually impossible.
Kitchen also had a system whereby if you were on commando, if your husband was on commando, you got half the rations of the women whose husbands were not.
As to the differentiation of rations between those whose husbands and fathers have surrendered and those whose relatives are still on commando, I will say that a more diabolical arrangement was never entered into by any civilized nation.
Early on, the instructions were that people who had come to the camp because of acts of war and they had actually been innocents within that, they would be given the ration A, which included a portion of meat. Those, however, who were belligerent and were in the camps would not be given the meat. But then this changes. Once they discover the situations within the camps is so dire, they change it, so actually basically putting everybody on the A ration. So everybody gets meat and everybody gets the basic ration.
It was about 1.5 cups of mealie or boer meal, 2 teaspoonfuls of sugar, a tablespoonful of coffee and a tablespoonful of salt, 1/12 of a tin of condensed milk, and some meat, if there was any available.
And it was on such a small scale that one woman complained that the food is too much to die from and too little to live from.
The quantity of the food is less, I carefully compared it, than the amount allowed in this country to criminals under hard labour. Here is the official report of the medical officer in this very camp about which we are inquiring today. Examined samples of the mealies and of the sugar used. Sample 1. Mouldy and contains mite, unfit for human consumption. This is given to little children. Sample 2. Contains mite, but I could not discover any living mite. It is very dangerous as human food.
There is enough evidence of purposeful addition of foreign stuff to the foodstuffs.
There were these barbed hooks in the meat. That's what that Kitchener did.
My grandmother swore it was poisoned. You know, there was glass in it, and she's had the proof, you know, with the little steel hooks in it and the whole tooth.
To what extent that was practiced, I wouldn't be able to. But that it happened is a fact.
The hooks came out of tins of canned meat from the USA. It was part of a huge shipment. It's very difficult to prove that the hooks were put in the tins on purpose.
Well, if you look at Epsom salts, which the British use if their horses get sick, if their roses are dying or anything, it's called Engelse sout in Afrikaans. And I'm sure that what they fed those people was not ground glass, but Epsom salts.
And you had the preposterous ideas like ground glass in the diet at Bloemfontein and things. And actually, the War Museum at Bloemfontein was an amazing exhibition of kind of race hatred in which, allegations of deliberate attempts to poison people with ground glass and things.
One should not forget that black concentration camps were also established, even though far less was reported about them at the time.
The historical writings of the 20th century on the Anglo-Boer War neglected this part of camps, in the case of the black people, to a large extent.
I do wish someone would come out and take up the question of the native camps. From odd bits I hear, it would seem to be much needed.
There is some indication that because of the shortage of housing and the terrible deprivation which the Boer families underwent in those camps, that very often the black servants, particularly the women, of course, lived in the same tent.
People who had grown up with Boer families. They were, in many instances, part of that family. When the women and children were taken away, a lot of these black people went with them. They were also put into the same camps, and then they were separated.
The black women who are in the white camps, for instance, you'll often see in the reports, they'll say 3 black servants or whatever amount, no rations. They weren't given rations, so the Boer women either had to share their rations with the black women, or the women had to somehow find something to live on themselves.
In many instances you had white camps close to black camps for the simple reason that they were close to the railway line.
When the first camps were formed around the white camps, at first they were given no rations. But if they would come in the white camp and clean the grounds, and there's lots of evidence of this, and clean latrines, remove the pails of waste at night, work in the hospitals, they were fed in return for that. So the first payment to black labor coming out of the black concentration camps, even before they were formally structured, was in return for work.
Mostly they were not given rations, mostly they were not given tents, and they were obliged in many instances to fend for themselves.
Some of them, they never got the shares, the rations, because they're not working, and then especially the old men and old women.
There was tremendous suffering among blacks because there was very little food other than what they could earn, and no medical care at all, especially in the Transvaal.
I don't think in the big military hospital at Deelfontein, I don't think there's records of any black people being treated there.
They became very ill, especially because of pneumonia, during winter, and then diarrhea because of some food were rotten.
One of the reasons I say the death rate is much higher than we know is because there were no records kept in the Transvaal until the middle of 1901, and many, many black people died there. We know, for example, at the Heidelberg camp, the medical officer of health for the Transvaal said they were dying there at a rate of about 1 a day. Well, that would mean about 30 a month, and etc.
In some of the black camps, you find names on the registers, but in many cases you only find numbers. And you get the impression that in the black camps, the bookkeeping was not all that meticulous.
It would be incorrect to think that the reason for the sweeping of the veld of the black farm workers was to provide labor. This was a byproduct. But there never was enough. And later, when the Department of Native Refugees was formed, it was even more organized. And every able-bodied black man was required to work for the army departments.
We are talking of a British army or an imperial army that in total was on to 450,000 men. To support an army like that, you need a labor force. And very many of these black people were taken to labor camps and were used also as laborers to support the British Army. In other words, a scorched earth policy had as a result white concentration camps of non-combatants, black refugee camps, black concentration camps and black labor camps.
Some people may have money and may add to the above by purchasing certain things at some little retail shops allowed in the camp, which charge exorbitant prices, for instance 6pence for a reel of cotton.
We have definitely different classes of refugee. We have those that have absolutely nothing. They have no shoes, they have rags on their backs, and they have no means of subsistence. We have others that have got all their furniture with them. They've obviously had a lot of help in transporting their goods with them, and therefore they've got money. They also have contacts outside of the camp who are willing to help and support them.
You must differentiate between the different camps, because even Emily Hobhouse is at pains to point out that the conditions vary between the camps enormously.
Norwal's Point is one of the best concentration camps. Because they grew their own food, they had the river nearby, so the morale of the people to do something and not just sit around and mope was much better.
As the camps went, Emily Hobhouse rated this camp the best that she visited. And she gave her reasons, mainly that it was well sited. The tents were laid out in rows with street names and numbers. The tents contained furniture, beds and mattresses. There was fresh spring water and a tennis court, and classes were held for the children. And the nearby Edinburgh, South Africa hospital provided medical services. And certainly laying out the tents in rows with street names is quite important to be able to find people.
It is also documented that in the camps conditions varied according to the camp commandant.
Perhaps what we ought to be paying more attention to is not assuming that there is one policy towards of concentration, one type of administration which is pursued by all commandants of the camps, but maybe we need to look at the particular individuals in those camps that we know where the death rates were at their worst.
Russell Deer, and he didn't pull his weight. If the English got rid of a camp commander, he must have been really bad.
When so many people were dying of measles, it was an epidemic. He boasted and said he was doing much better in the camp than the troops were doing on the battlefields.
William Gosling, who was camp commandant, a magistrate, he fought for the camp inhabitants at Springfontein. He went against orders, and then he caught double pneumonia, died, and is buried at Springfontein Cemetery. But it is a measure of his success, perhaps, that 700 people went to his funeral. Springfontein Cemetery is a mixed cemetery. There are British soldiers and British administration people, as well as women and children. It is a very evocative place. It is a surprising place. It has one source of water, which was a continuous source, fortunately, for the women and children, and that is today recognized as a monument. But it has a graveyard for unbaptized children on its outskirts, bearing in mind that perhaps the current feeling then was that these children would never be able to be buried with children who had been confirmed or had a religion, because they would go straight to hell. And it's pathetic, these little gravestones.
Those who are suffering most keenly and who have lost most either of their children by death or their possessions by fire and sword, such as these reconcentrated women in the camps, they have the most conspicuous patience and never express a wish that their men should be the ones to give way. It must be fought out now, they think, to the bitter end.
If one looks particularly at the role of Boer women in this war, one has abundant testimony, both from sources amongst the commandos and their families, and from the British soldiers who recorded their impressions during the guerrilla phase of the war, of Boer women, often grandmothers as well as wives, who kept their men fighting who stood up to the British soldiery, told them that the Boers would never give in, and are shown actually sending back their husbands and sons when they come home to put their feet up for a bit.
And they were extremely strong-minded, and I think in very many instances they were actually the people that kept their husbands up, that motivated them, and in Meerbank especially.
They were called irreconcilables, and some of them were sent to camps in Natal, Meerbank, amongst other places where the British thought they were a bad influence in the original camp, and they influenced people negatively in favour of the war, so they had to be sent away.
They were seen as hardliners, people who were troublesome, caused a lot of trouble, and that's why they were sent down here. So it was like a punitive measure.
There were also those women who argued that continuing the war is a waste of resources, and that the Boer leaders are actually responsible for continuing the war and for keeping us in the camp. And then gradually they came round to the British side, and there are documentary examples of women who come joyfully sewing a Union Jack at the end of the war as a sign of an offering to the superintendent of the camp of their newfound loyalties.
The wives of these two groups, factions, would squabble and not get on at all well together. And of course that's very bad in a confined area like a camp. I believe it was Lord Kitchener who divided the inmates in the camp into two categories. One category being very pro-Boer and supporting the Boer cause. The other category being, well, not necessarily pro-British, but more neutral. They used to assist the British authorities, help to run the camp, would work perhaps for the British authorities.
My grandmother told me a lot of stories when I was young about circumstances and what happened to them, and how they especially hated the Hanskakis, you see. And the commander was a Hanskaki. He was actually an English-speaking Afrikaner.
Especially under the command of a certain McCowitz, he seems to have really hated the Boers. That's obvious from their documents. He couldn't care less about their general well-being. They particularly complained a lot about the meat.
The problem with the meat was that the British had to transport it to the camps. They didn't have any cooler trucks or modern equipment, and often the meat had gone rotten by the time it reached the people. In addition to that, the meat was of a very poor quality. Due to the scorched earth policy, the animals had not been fed properly.
It was rotten meat cut from rotten animals, and they said it was so green and sticky and putrid that when they threw it against a wall, it stuck to it.
They went to the camp commanders and said, "Look, this meat's full of maggots, we can't eat it." Then Jacobs made the mistake of telling them that the meat was good enough for them. And Minnie Else was 14 years old, and she grabbed his own sjambok and started chasing him around the tents. And another lady, Mrs. van Biljon, grabbed a bottle and crowned Van Eden with it, and then she asked, "Is he dead now?" The men ran away. They never saw them again.
They were very angry, and then they stormed his office. They looted the place, broke his furniture, tore up his books, and from there they set off to the rations house, where they threw sand and things into the food, which resulted in them not having anything to eat for a few days.
The death rate in most of the camps is high. In Bloemfontein, it is terrible. 172 deaths had occurred up to the date of my leaving. On Sunday, April the 28th, 15 persons died in that camp. It figures out to about 25%. Above all, one would hope that the good sense, if not the mercy of the English people, would cry out against further development of this cruel system, which falls with such crushing effect upon the old, the weak, and the children.
In the period May to August 1901, the High Commissioner, Lord Milner, goes to London on a visit. Then Lord Kitchener, apart from his army duties and having to look at these civilians, black and Boer civilians, he also acts as the High Commissioner at a very crucial stage in the development of these camps, because it's the period just before the start of the great suffering and deaths in the camps.
October 1901, which was the very worst month in the South African camps in general, an enormous number of people died in Mafeking camp. So if we go to the cemetery, look up the cemetery records, we find that a large proportion of people who did die died in October 1901. There can be various reasons for this. Some will say that the conditions on the farms were probably at their worst at that time, and the people who came were more undernourished than they had been previously.
One has to understand the climate firstly during those winter years of especially 1901, where some of the coldest months that the Free State ever had. If you look at the figures, the deaths in the camps during those months, the winter months.
Yes, especially in October, November, December, under normal circumstances, that's the time for a lot of stomach problems with babies and things like that. And if you're in a tent, it's exacerbated.
People were crowded together, large numbers. Brandfort, 4,000 people in one camp, Bloemfontein, 6,000 people. Whenever an epidemic struck a camp, it spread like wildfire through the camp.
Met die measles epidemic.
During the measles epidemic, there was no medicine whatsoever for them. And in her book, my aunt writes that in some tents, the mother and all her children were struck by measles.
If you were under the age of 2 years, and I will actually say under the age of 5 years, if you were placed in a camp, it was the same as if your death warrant had been signed. Because you had almost no chance of survival if you were under 5 years old. And definitely under 1 year, no chance at all.
Well, of the 270 children that died, one family, the Krugers, lost 12 children. Van der Merwe's 9, Van der Walt's 9, Venter's 9, Van Niekerk's 8, Pienaar's 8, Pretoria's 7, Van Schalkwyk 6, Viljoen 6, Forster 6. When you think about it, 270 children in this district died today. That would be a whole generation that would gone.
Give back my dead, whom thou hast riven from me by arms of men loud called from earth's farthest bound to wet my bosom with my children's blood. Give back my dead, the dead who grew up on me.
My grandmother's family fled, and my grandfather's family went to the concentration camp. And the deaths were suffered by the family that went to the concentration camp.
Oma Rautenbach. Grandma Rautenbach didn't want to go to a concentration camp. She knew about the camps, and she asked the farm labourers to warn her when the English were on their way. They did, and she fled, but she only got as far as Witsishoek. There, in a ruin, she gave birth to a baby. Her sister-in-law thought the baby was dead. Die baba was kammer doodgebore. But Grandma Rautenbach said we should at least bath the child before we bury her. Apparently the bath water was far too hot, and that made Max scream. She was only buried 2 years ago at the age of 98.
The women and children out in the veld, isolated, were very, very well protected from these diseases. In fact, in such a way that I would argue that the children certainly were safer with their parents or with their mothers in the open veld than in the concentration camps.
This is an age of disease. This is something to be borne in mind. The British Army arrives in Bloemfontein, and then it suffers a major epidemic of infectious disease, and the casualty toll from infectious disease is way beyond that actually experienced on the battlefield.
I suppose the feeling was, well, our men are dying of disease. It makes no difference if the Boers die.
Prince Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, one of the soldiers who went out to fight, died of typhoid.
The only ray of light in that war was the fact that the inoculation against typhoid got its main thrust during that war. It's one of the things that this war gave to the world.
What really killed most of the people was measles, and that would have happened even if conditions had been better.
You have to remember it was the time before vitamins were known about, and although there is no excuse for it, of course, because it was the British policy of total war that forced the women and children into these camps, in no sense can the British be held entirely responsible for every single death.
There were no large hospitals. They were mostly hutment hospitals or hospitals under canvas.
My mother got diphtheria in the camp. They hid her away at first because they were afraid. Because of all the children who went to hospital, very few came back. But later on, when she became too ill, they could not hide her anymore, and then the camp sister came to take her to hospital.
Neither they nor their children understood English. And the mothers felt that it was impossible to give the child into the care of somebody who did not understand him, who did not really care for him, and this after the very often barbarous method in which these people were gathered for the concentration camp. One cannot blame the mothers for not trusting the British.
One couldn't do much for typhoid. You give sloppy foods, you give milk, you starve the patient. That was what happened in the camps, and that was a source of misunderstanding between the medical authorities on the British side and the mothers of the children. They saw the child weakened, they thought that the child needed strong food to make it better.
So the British are coming with one perspective on how to prevent this disease, the Boer women are coming with another perspective, and neither of them had the tools that we have today.
This was a misunderstanding far beyond language. It was a misunderstanding of culture.
You must remember that the Boers were in the interior of the country from the 18th, 19th century, and they had brought a 17th century medical system with them, which was even in Britain also in use up to a certain stage in the 19th century.
There's this Huis Apotheek, which was a box of medicines, patent medicines. The original ones came from Germany. And then there were a series of, I suppose one could call folk traditions of healing, which are much more difficult to come to terms with today. Things like using goat's dung, or dung was often used in a lot of these things, or animal parts, which they would tie around children's necks.
A certain number of Boer women, and this is really backed up with mountainous evidence, 14 blue books, some of them 500 pages long, kept to unhygienic standards of living which had been fine when they were on the veldt, and there were tens of miles, sometimes hundreds of miles between them. But when they were all cooped up in relatively small areas, this turned into tremendous danger in terms of hygiene. The use of cow dung and goat dung, for example, in medicinal ways was a disaster when diphtheria and cholera and typhoid were the major killers.
Well, the British Blue books, of course, are government publications by Britain, and what one should remember is that that is one side of the story, and apart from that, you should read those books critically. Who were the reporters there?
Kitchener's report in this instance is based on that of one of the inspectors, Kendall Franks, who was sent to inspect the camps shortly after the great measles epidemic.
And Kendall Franks was very prejudiced against the Boers, not understanding that there is a difference in medical tradition. He looked at it from the upper middle class British point of view in the late 19th century.
This was his finding, that what these women really needed was sharp discipline. And if that was the case, we would not have this sort of trouble. And what they needed was a bar of blue soap.
They had this absolute passion for having all the tents lined up in neat rows. And they often didn't do this. They'd move their tents to be next to friends or other members of the family. So he saw this as being something which was in some way detrimental to health.
So when you have a British medical officer saying to them in the mornings, let the air run through your camp, let the air go into your tent, open up the side flaps, take your bedding out and dry it in the sun or whatever, which would have been the normal regime for a British army camp. This is immediately thought of by the internees as being another way of getting at them, if you like.
the Boers saw sweating out of a fever as a solution. That was a typical 17th century idea in medical practice.
The problem with those doctors' reports and with the report of the Fawcett Commission, in one level they did their work. They did point out the deficiencies, but it's the language in which the whole thing is couched. Got these very kind of middle-class comments on what people wore. They would go into these camps and the women would say, we haven't got enough clothing, and they'd make them show what they're wearing. And then they describe, one woman, for instance, had gaudy clothing, they'll say, or dirty embroidery on it. And you get this kind of judgmental attitude. They're still not taking full responsibility. They're doing this job of shifting the blame onto the women, saying that the women are dirty, they live in this fetid atmosphere, they don't look after their children properly, all those sorts of things.
The moment the conditions in the camps were improved, because of Emily Hophouse's visit and exposure of the whole situation, and the Fawcett Commission's changes that they had proposed, the moment these changes occurred and you had better medical facilities and doctors and food, the death rate dropped dramatically.
When your husband is in Bermuda or India or Ceylon and you have children he may never see again, or worse, you have a child of 6 or 7 who gets enteric and dies, take a picture of that child. Misunderstood by the British as being bizarre and cruel. How else would that father know what his daughter or his son looked like at the end?
Propaganda is an inherent part of preparation for and the conducting of a war. And the propaganda usually goes all out to paint your opponent in the most awful colours.
I think people would be naive if they would think for a second that 100 years ago the British government wasn't involved in a massive propaganda ploy.
There was a government propaganda machine. I think a lot of people simply went along with it. You know, these Boers must be taught a lesson. President Kruger, as they called him, is an evil old man, and all that sort of stuff.
The Daily Mail had a series of articles, even before the war started, about what was the cause of the war. And they had a picture of the typical Boer. And the typical Boer for the Daily Mail was a man in a hat and a coat and trousers who was a government spy persecuting Uitlanders. Not a nice person at all, not reliable, and not at all somebody you wanted to associate with. Later on, again, it was the Daily Mail which was particularly strong on anti-Boer propaganda of a very simple-minded and direct kind.
It was inevitable that there was going to be a certain amount of demonisation of the enemy. This went on both sides. There was a good deal of Boer demonisation of the British, especially the British officer class and the British royal family. It was just part of the new style of warfare that you not only had to fight him, but you had to hate him. In doing that, they actually made out the Boer people to be tremendously primitive, people of the book, they would be called, and they were talking about the Old Testament rather than the New. And it was a way, really, of making the Boers less of individuals and more as a sort of a group that could be collectively despised.
The propaganda machine was really quite powerful. It was being aided for the first time, we must remember, by the moving film. And there are some wonderful bits of black and white footage, which are of course made up. They're sort of bits of theatre, but they do show Afrikaner, Boer treachery. British prisoners are shot. Nurses are attacked. Boers beg for water, water's brought for them, they shoot the people who bring the water. So there's that idea that the Afrikaners can't be trusted, they're not really like us, they're not gentlemen.
Propaganda was rife, the conditions were terrible, and they were under no circumstances going to tell the British public what they were doing in South Africa, which after all was some 6,000 miles away.
It's even said, for instance, that these Boer women and children, so many of them are crowded into tents because that's the way they naturally live anyway.
In fact, they were portrayed to the British public almost as sort of, well, not exactly holiday camps, but certainly humanitarian camps, refugee camps at worst.
Remember that Britain was controlling the press of Europe with the cable lines from Cape Town. And therefore, what was going through to Europe was the British propaganda.
If revelations come that actually we have a sort of genocide, even if it's unintentional, people are dying like flies and so on, this is not very nice to acknowledge.
The British public did not believe this. But as more and more and more reports started to come through, something had to be done.
And then you find in the European press the stories coming through of the British concentration camps and the suffering there. And this becomes a very strong voice.
People in France, people in Germany, people in Russia, people in Holland, people in the United States are all in fact fastening on to the camps. You know, that Britain is now pursuing a barbaric war in South Africa. So certainly in terms of Britain's international position, it's not doing it any good at all.
Some of the really powerful stuff, of course, comes from France and Germany and America. And there, the British atrocities are played out in cartoon form, in all sorts of representations of brutality. So the propaganda war swirls around.
The masses, the populations of these countries were to a great extent pro-Boer, as was discovered when Paul Kruger went to Europe in December 1900. He was along the routes in France and in the Netherlands and in Belgium. He was accepted by these people, like Mr. Mandela was accepted 90 years later.
There were many brave women on Boer side during the war, but I think the bravest woman of all was Emily Alves.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, including many of you who have traveled far to be with us today, we are gathered here to pay homage to one who came to our shores many years ago in a gesture of love and kindness. Her name is great and reverenced, not only in South Africa, but also in thousands of homes on the continent of Europe. We stood alone in the world, friendless among the people. The smallest nation ranged against the mightiest empire on earth. Then one small hand, the hand of a woman, was stretched out to us.
As a humanitarian and belonging to a humanitarian benefit society, if you like, she was sent by her committee to come and visit this country and see how they could perhaps help.
She's what we would call an aid worker now, and she manages to get through the net. Other people hadn't been able to go and see the camps.
She was also very restricted as to where she was allowed to go.
She was here for 3 months during the war, mainly in Bloemfontein, also in Springfontein, Norwal, Spawn, Kimberley, a few other places, Mafeking.
She wasn't allowed to go to any camps in the Transvaal.
And what she sees is absolutely horrifying to her, because she expects she was just going to deliver these sort of extras, comforts, and she finds that absolutely basic things aren't there.
She asked for soap. She asked that the water be boiled. She asked that the rations be improved.
She felt she had to stand up and speak for the women and children who were being treated in an inhuman way. being killed, dying, because nobody was bothering about proper medicines and proper doctoring and proper treatment in the camps.
It was about 4 o'clock of a scorching afternoon when I set foot in the camp, and I can't tell you what I felt like, so I won't try. I call this camp system a wholesale cruelty. It can never be wiped out of the memories of the people. It presses hardest on the children. They droop in the terrible heat, and with the insufficient, unsuitable food. Whatever you do, whatever the authorities do, and they are, I believe, doing their best with very limited means, it is all only a miserable patch upon a great ill.
Kitchener, I think it is fair to say, if he didn't hate women, he didn't like them much. He once said to his sister Emily, who came to Egypt wearing 6 guns and smoking a cigar, "What is wrong with women?" Perhaps Kitchener's greatest confrontation was with Emily Hobhouse, when he called her that bloody woman.
She had a very hard time with Kitchener. You know, her first trip she made, I don't think he realised what was happening. And when she went back and she went to Parliament with all the bad news, then when she came out the second time, she did that long sea voyage, and he actually arrested her at Cape Town docks. He wouldn't let her off the ship, and she was ill. And she had to turn around and go all the way back.
She was much more than just a pro-Boer apologist. She believed very passionately throughout her life in supporting people who were the underdog. She made herself extremely unpopular during the First World War because she took a very similar attitude towards the women and children in Germany.
And she had been writing letters back to Britain, telling them what was going on. Some of the letters had been published, and the government labelled her a liar because she interfered in their scheme of punishment to the Boer women and children.
So they knew what they were doing, and they didn't want it spread around.
She was a very courageous woman. She stood up for what she believed in, and she was not exactly mealy-mouthed. The letters she writes to the Times and the way she approached things, she was quite sharp and quite savage.
When the saga of the concentration camps comes along, and when these camps are defended, when people argue against Emily Hobhouse and send letters to the Times to say that Emily Hobhouse is misrepresenting what's happened there, the British public are inclined to believe those defences of the camps.
There was the story of Lizzie van Zyl. If you ever see a picture of Lizzie van Zyl, she looks as if she'd come out of Auschwitz. The picture was published all over Britain. The London Daily Mail published it, saying that this was a picture taken by a British doctor of this child. And it was an indication of Boer mistreatment. But it was actually a picture taken by a Boer photographer. The picture was used for propaganda left, right and centre in England. It was how Boer people treated their children. It was 101 different things. Emily's answer was quite simple. She knew Lizzie van Zyl. She knew her mother and how her mother had struggled. It turned into a huge fight, really, between the British administration and Emily.
Her voice was heard, and in Parliament this came through, and it became an uneasy reminder for the British that something terrible was happening in South Africa, something that we're not aware of.
She persuaded the leader of the Liberal Party, Campbell Bannerman, to take it up. Campbell Bannerman made in his famous speech the denunciation of this policy of farm burning and the neglect in the camps. I mean, he called this methods of barbarism. When is war not a war when it's conducted by methods of barbarism?
Questions were asked in the House of Commons. There were debates and demands for an investigative ladies' commission or committee to be set up to go and see exactly what was happening in these camps.
I think one of the reasons there was so much pro-Boer sentiment in London was because the British people, and Emily Hobhouse said it very well. She said, "I'm not, to Milner, I'm not pro-Boer, I'm British. This isn't our way. So something went very wrong in South Africa.
Millicent Fawcett and her committee of ladies who visited many of these camps gave a famous report which led to the rapid improvement of conditions and the eventual transfer of the administration of these camps into civilian control.
And in due course, the death rate came right down, showing that those deaths need not have happened at all.
Had the British government recognized and done what Emily Hobhouse had suggested they do, a year earlier, a lot of lives would have been saved.
There was a time lag of about anything from 3 to 5 months before things became effective. But when things became effective, the rations increased, but only right at the end, near 1902, did they actually receive fruit and vegetables.
When on the 31st of May 1902, the Boer delegates at Vereniging decided by 54 votes to 6 to accept the peace proposals or the terms of surrender of the British. One of the reasons that was cited why they decided to accept it was that they were scared that the Afrikaner folk, the Afrikaner people, would in fact die out in the concentration camps.
The scorched earth policy meant that the state of South Africa after this war was far more devastated and took far longer to recover economically than anybody had expected. A huge devastation of the land, 30,000 or so Boer farms burnt and destroyed, a huge destruction of livestock, and an enormous problem of resettling.
30,000 farmsteads were burned to the ground. Each of those farmsteads, a family Bible was lost, containing the family tree. You know, the Afrikaners were very, very particular about family trees in those days. They lost photographs, they lost heirlooms, they lost artifacts, which had been passed from generation to generation over a period of, say, 200 years. That's all been lost. Now, you can be cynical and you can also be practical, and you can say, but you can replace the people lost in the Anglo-Boer War, but you cannot replace the heritage which the Afrikaners lost.
The concentration camps, and more particularly also the broader British scorched earth policy, left a terrible legacy of bitterness and of hatred in southern Africa. Hatred from the side of many Afrikaans-speaking people at the beginning of the 20th century against everything that was English.
My own mother, I remember very well how she constantly referred to your Anglo-Boer War, your concentration camps, and what was done. And the feeling of, pain and suffering which was there runs very, very deep.
I do think that the white concentration camps are the most indelible event in the history of the Afrikaner, even today.
And the wounds caused by that and the feeling of injustice, I think, had a traumatic effect which carried through also the next generation.
I asked myself the question, what would have been the case if we had something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the Boer War in 1902? Because I think that could serve the purpose, or could have served the purpose, to ensure that the ongoing hatred and need for the feeling of revenge that existed in the minds of the Boer people after the war could have been addressed through such a commission.
Who is to be blamed? Now, I am inclined to blame the Boer generals on one side. I think it was irrational for them to continue with the war, given the conditions in which the women and children were living and the large numbers that died, etc.
Every Boer male commando who survived that war and lost a wife or children during it had to live with this terrible reflection that he had been unable to defend the women and children and had exported to his enemy the job of actually doing that while the war continued.
Now, how was it possible that they could be so irrational? Now, they were simple religious people. There was an absolute belief that God will give them the victory over this British people that they regard as people from the devil.
We must remember that the Boer generals weren't the policymakers. Both the republics had governments in the field. Certainly they were very much influenced by the generals. What made them carry on wasn't just to extend the war, but they were fighting for a principle. They were fighting against injustice, taking away their independence. What they were trying to do, and especially President Steyn, was to continue this war as long as possible to force Britain to come to terms.
If the Boers had surrendered at the time of the fall of the capitals and had not taken the guerrilla war on, you wouldn't have had the terrible loss of life and loss of civilian life, and you would have had a much more honourable end to what was to turn into a pretty dishonourable conflict.
But on the other hand, I think Britain must take a large part of the blame for this extraordinary destructive war.
The blame for the excesses of the concentration camp policy tend to be heaped on Kitchener because he took over from Lord Roberts at the end of 1900, and the worst death rates and the highest concentrations of Boer and black civilians in camps occurred during 1901 to 2.
Kitchener didn't make policy entirely on his own. There was a Secretary of State back in London, there was Milner, the High Commissioner, there was the Prime Minister. It was a policy that was made by an awful lot more people than just Lord Kitchener.
The camps were very much a sideline. It's even doubtful how fully aware he personally was of the sheer scale of what was happening in these camps.
Kitchener claimed all along he didn't have enough railway space to send more food and tents. But my research has shown that when they moved the black concentration camps away from the white camps to the farms to grow food, where they were compelled to grow food, they were able to come up with 600 railway cars in 2 months, but the most they could give the camps, the white camps, was 35 to 45 cars a month. So there was a deliberate act on the part of Lord Kitchener not to provide what could have been provided for the camps. I know that's a serious charge.
What should happen is Kitchener should have been put on trial for war crimes. There's no two ways about it.
Manslaughter on a massive scale against the most vulnerable of our republics, the population of our republics, the women and children.
If the Anglo-Boer War took place today and the same scenario was playing itself out in South Africa, believe you me, Britain would be charged with crimes against humanity. No question about it.
As a war crime, it should have been punished. And not only that, as a war crime, we should get an apology. I don't think that would be ever be forthcoming. Her Majesty, who was here 4 years ago, spoke at a dinner in Pretoria of detention camps. She spoke of a new willingness towards reconciliation for detention camps.
The British somehow perceive themselves as still a power to reckon in world affairs, and it is not in their history to come and apologize to any situation there, whether they have been part of that or they have been indirectly involved. They have not apologized in any situation.
Of course they have to apologize. What the British had done in South Africa was immoral. The kind of war that they fought was an immoral war. They had created tremendous damage in this country, damage which had its historical effect for decades afterwards, also in terms of the relations between the various population groups in this country.
It was very pleasing for the royal family to say at Brantford, "We are embarrassed and we are ashamed of what happened here."
They are ashamed, but they can't apologize. I think they want to, but they can't. Because if they do apologize, they are in the same boat as Nazi Germany.
My feeling about apologizing for your ancestors' mistakes is that perhaps we could all get a bit too Japanese and we would be apologizing for everything, because I'm afraid, like all people, ancestors make a great number of mistakes.
Where does it all stop? I mean, do we ask the French to apologise for that little unpleasantness in 1066 when King Harold got an arrow in his eye?
I think an apology would be utterly meaningless.
This feeling that people have to apologise. Somebody, I believe, suggested Queen Elizabeth has to come here and apologise for what Kitchener and Milner and that lot did. I think that's nonsense. She wasn't there. She wasn't responsible for it.
I'm personally very dubious about this habit now of apologising for the sins of your fathers or grandfathers or maybe your great-grandfathers. I think there's something slightly humbuggish about it. I think that the normal way of doing that is if a Prime Minister visits a country or a Foreign Secretary visits a country, you can indicate, both in the way you talk to the people of that country, that you're not proud of what was done in the past, and sometimes it's appropriate to go and pay tribute at some memorial or other.
But I do feel this great human tragedy of the camps, black and white, happened on such a vast scale and was so unnecessary that I personally would, if anyone had listened to me, I would have said there could be a dignified apology for it.
Soon after the Peace of Vereniging, the Boer generals, notably the war hero de Wet, visited the camps to explain the negotiated peace. Some women could not accept the principle, protesting that they were resigned to carry on till the bitter end and pay the ultimate price for their freedom. But gradually the burghers arrived from commando to reclaim their families. Many of them left, as they had arrived, on loaned wagons, transporting their meagre belongings back to their ruined farms, with a bell tent to start again. The complex logistical exercise to ship Boer prisoners of war back from faraway locations like St. Helena, Bermuda and India meant that most of the camps were in operation for months after the war. Anticipation and uncertainty were constant companions. Many moving tales are told of emotional reunions and tearful visits to the cluttered camp cemeteries as fathers paid their last respects to the children they would never see again. The last camps were finally struck in 1903. All that remain today are rusted artifacts in the veldt, and some restored cemeteries that bear the names of children and their mothers who paid the ultimate price of war. Some of the black camps were never resolved. Unable to go back to their farms, the inmates were forced to stay in the camps, and some of the townships, as they are known today, were formed.
It is very clear today when we commemorate this war, we find out new graves, new sites, new stories, new faces, new names, hardly known to all who believed that it was a white man's war.
The bringing in of new information about who actually occupied the camps and that it was a shared experience, both of black and white, will endear the larger community of South Africa to the whole question of the concentration camps. It will be seen in a more holistic way.
If though all of us in South Africa, both black and white, look at the history, share it, reveal our deepest feelings, also the anger, the suffering, the pain which is there on both sides. Only then can we expect that there will be a full restitution and peace in our country.
The mother sat on her little trunk with the child across her knee. She had nothing to give it, and the child was sinking fast. We watched the child draw its last breath in reverent silence. The mother neither moved nor wept. Dry-eyed but deathly white, she sat there, in the depths of grief beyond all tears.
And now, 100 years later, when South Africans reflect on the tragic events that shaped their history, they are compelled to seek reconciliation of their deeply divided society for a future of peace rather than conflict.
Now we have a new type of war, Boer War, being depicted. Now we have the politics of the rainbow nation in the 90s and the new millennium. And what happens now? We have something called everyone's war.
In the same way that the American Civil War is the war that is America, this war is the war that is South Africa.
Looking at the two issues of the scorched earth and the concentration camp, that war is bad. War destroys not only life, it destroys the environment.
The problem is that war is immoral, and it was an unjust war.
And then it was immoral wrong then to use the women and civilians in general and the children and the Africans in the concentration camps. Memories which are very terrible are being created, and they will last from one generation to the other.